There's some settings here called label. The label is just for your own reference. It can be anything that you want. And this actually is going to be the name of the fixture that's going to be shown in underneath Vista's fixture chooser icon. So we can call this LED wash. The fixture number, this is quite important in Vista. Every fixture in our show file will have a unique number, and that number is the fixture number. So every time we patch something, this number will auto increment by 1. So it's a unique identifier. Multi-patch, I'll come back and explain shortly. The Dmx Universe, this is the universe tab that we want to patch to up here at the top. And the Dmx address is the starting address within that specified universe. The absolute address, the easiest way to explain this is absolute address 513 would be Dmx Universe 2, address 1. So this setting just carries on up past 512, imagining it like there's no limit of 512 channels per universe. Some theaters like to use this, for example, if they're using 600 dimmer channels. Let's pop that back down to 1 for now. And like I said, the spacing, if you don't change this, this also tells you how many Dmx channels the fixture takes up, but I'll explain that in a little bit more detail very shortly. So to patch 10 of these washers, we can just hit patch or enter, and we see that they're patched one after another in the universe tab. So we see the ID number increasing by 1 every time. You can see they're all called LED wash. And you also get a little shadow just where my mouse is just here. This tells you where that start address is, just to give you a little identifier. So this is how you patch lights. So we just repeat this process for other fixtures in our show file. So if I type for a different set of fixtures, let's find a Viper profile. Again, I can say there's 10 of these, and we'll call these spots. You'll also notice that the fixture number has changed to the next available slot, which is 11. You don't have to, if you don't want to, fill in this tabbed information here. The reason for that is we can actually click and hold on the fixtures that we want to patch, and then whilst holding that click, drag into the patch. So you can see that we can do a visual patch. So if I drag these back to number 1, we've now addressed these fixtures at 1. This same drag and drop action is the same way that we would repatch fixtures. To select fixtures in your patch, you can click on them individually, and the selection will add. Or if you left click in an empty space, you'll notice a little binding box, so we can drag over multiple fixtures. So to repatch some fixtures, we can just click and drag to the same universe, or if you come up here to the top, you can also repatch them to a different universe, and that's all you have to do. All the programming and everything else comes with the fixtures. At this point in the webinar, it might also be a good point to explain that Vista has all of the normal sorts of undo, redo, copy, paste commands that follow the same shortcuts that you're using on your operating system. So if I press Edit, Undo, or Control Z, you can see that these actions are undone, or you can redo them with the similar commands as well. When you're repatching something, if something goes red, it means that it can't be patched there. The reasons for this is there might be something blocking it, so something already patched there, or you might have run out of fixtures, Dmx channels within that universe. But for now, let's go back and pop these over here. I'll just patch 10 more moving fixtures. We'll patch the Robin Pointy. We'll call these the beams. So you can see that I'm just repeating this finding the patch and drag and drop process. Let's click into Universe 3, and we'll just clear this out. Underneath our factory library, we have 2 other drop-downs. The first one is a generics folder. This is where we can find common formats that don't necessarily need a unique fixture profile. So you might find things here like floodlights, fluorescence, but also we can find some common LED formats as well, which we'll come back to in a second. So if I just search for the word dimmer, this will just be a single channel intensity just here. I'm going to patch a couple of these. I'm going to patch 6, and we're going to have some blue picans in my example, so we can see the name blue. I'm just going to drag these in here I'm going to repeat that process for some red dimmers as well. We'll be using these later in the webinar. Same thing for the amber fixtures just here. So it's just normal old school power cans with some blue gel in them. If I next search for some luster to direct profiles, you can drag this line out a little bit if the line's sometimes a little bit too big, and select this fixture just here. I'm going to patch 6 of these as well. I'll call them the profiles. But I just want to go back for a second and talk about the spacing. So each one of these fixtures takes up 8 Dmx channels, but you can increase the spacing. So this would be putting a gap in between each patch. This might be to match a certain plot that you've been given, or just to make your life easier so you can know that the number is going to be 101, 121, 141, etc. So we can see that if I drag this into here, you can see the spacing is working. It's now got the 8 channels patched, which then leaves 9 through 20 as a gap before it patches its next fixture over here as well. I'm going to do one more example. I'm going to search for RGBAW. So this is just like a generic LED format that you might find. And instead of doing a multi-patch, or sorry, multiple quantity, I'm going to show you the multi-patch. So if I patch 4 of these, what will be happening here is that we're patching 4 unique Dmx addresses, but they're going to be controlled by a single fixture, which is fixture 55. So you might want to use this on things like blinders or something like that. Some extra tools that I'd just like to point out. If you do make a mistake when you're patching, you might want to rename or renumber something. That can be done by selecting the fixtures, right-clicking, and from the contextual menu that pops up, you can find actions such as label fixtures or renumber, or of course delete. This is actually a good tip throughout the use of Vista's software. If in doubt, point to it or right-click it, and usually something sensible will pop up. So let's label these fixtures. We'll call it the profile. And a nice little tip that I can give you here, when you rename something or relabel something in Vista, if you press the hashtag, you'll notice that that then labels them 1, 2, 3, 4. So this can be a nice little tip. The new feature in the upcoming V3 release is that we can actually label the universe tabs at the top here, and that's done in this label universe setting just here. So I can call this power cans and dimmers, and we'll see that up at the top here. So that can help us organize our show files a little bit nicer. In addition to the table view, Vista also has a list view, which is like a spreadsheet style way of viewing your patch information. And the columns can be arranged ascending or descending, depending on what you're pressing. Everything here can be changed by double-clicking it and altering the label or the address or whatever you need to. But another nice feature is we also have a search filter towards the top. So if I type the word blue now, you can see that this just references all of my blue dimmer fixtures. This might arguably be a nice clearer way of seeing the Dmx addresses instead of looking at that table view. The third patch view is called the Dmx View, and this just gives you a output indication in Dmx bit form, so 0 to 255 of each Dmx channel. So you can see it's highlighted slightly when there's values above 0. So this screen can be useful if you're troubleshooting or just want to see the actual Dmx output of the console. One of the most important windows within the patch view is called the Connect Universes window over here. This is where we route Vista's virtual universes to physical outputs, be that on our console or perhaps Lightning Network. So if I press Connect Universes, you can see that in this example, I have my UD512 USB DMX device connected. So that's the connected tick box here. This is important. You need to watch for that. And the second most important column is the Vista universe. So this is where we route this universe to this physical port in our system. And we can adjust the numbers here again by using these arrows or by typing a numerical number in this box. In today's training, we're going to be working with a virtual console. So I'll just click into my virtual console view for now. And to make our lives a little bit easier to see, I'm going to delete my EX console and just add a new one, a little smaller one. Let's add in the MV console just here. In real life, if this was connected, we'd see the connected tick boxes here, and we assign Vista universes in the exact same way, just here. If we're working with Ethernet-based lighting networks, Ethernet to DMX nodes, quite often they automatically appear in this window, but sometimes you may also want to add a manual network connection. To do that, you press Add Network Connection, and the Add Network Connection window pops up. The protocols that Vista supports are ArtNet, Pathport, or Streaming ACN, and to add one of these settings, we just click in here and set the appropriate settings on our network. Just for demonstration purposes today, I'm going to add 4 ArtNet broadcast ports. So I just click Add. You can see the setting increases by 1 every single time. So let's just add 1 more. And we assign the Vista universes to these just the same as we would our actual Vista consoles, just by typing numerically in here. Another new feature in the next R3 release is an additional column called Output Enabled. And with this, we can choose to enable or disable an individual Ethernet-based protocol, which can be useful if you're touring festivals and you need to connect to the rig without actually outputting data. It's important to mention, though, that if you're using a physical Vista console and outputting on 5-pin DMX, the output is always enabled. You can't disable that, other than having it unassigned in the Vista Universe column. One of the last things to mention in the patch screen is our macros buttons found towards the top left of the screen just here. And these are the macros that are built into our fixtures. To work with these, you would select fixtures and then click one of them. So strike is our lamp on command if you're using traditional lamps. Douse would be a lamp off command, and reset would perform a full mechanical calibration of that unit. So clicking one of these would open up the DMX macro window, and clicking OK would actually trigger that command. So that's all you have to do. But if you did want to stagger that timing, for example, 5 seconds, in between each macro command, Vista would wait 5 seconds. So perhaps if you're using some portable power, you're not going to be blowing up the whole rig by striking hundreds of discharge lamps potentially at the same time. So that pretty much concludes a little introduction to Vista's patch screen. The next section that I'd like to talk about is within the Fixture Chooser view, which is Vista's 3rd window up here. So let's click it. In the Fixture Chooser view, you'll notice all fixtures that you've just patched. You can zoom in and out of this view by using your scroll wheel on your mouse. Or there's also some little navigational zooms down at the bottom. You can zoom out by clicking, or you can zoom in by clicking the plus here as well. The 100% will zoom to fit all of your fixtures in the available Fixture Chooser space, which will be this space right now. The little red symbol, this is actually quite useful. This is zoom to fit the selected fixtures. So if you select some fixtures by left-clicking and dragging, you can click the red symbol. This will just zoom into these guys. Then perhaps you could zoom back out, select some other fixtures, and zoom into these. So this can provide actually quite an efficient way of navigating your layout. I should mention that the square icons are the individual fixtures in our show, and the pentagon icons, which are red in this theme, are groups. So Vista does make auto groups of the same fixture type for you. We'll be making some of our own very shortly. It's important to mention that when we patch fixtures, we can actually start working with these straight away. So if I started to make a fixture selection and then use some of the fixture browsers on the right-hand side, this actually would output straight away. So in theory, we could program some fixtures straight away. But it's advantageous just to create a more personal layout, because this may help increase your programming efficiency. So to select fixtures, we can drag over multiple by left-clicking and dragging. So I can drag over all of my parkans, and profiles here. And to move these around the space, we just left click and drag over to a different space where we want them. So we can do the same with the dimmer group just here as well. So this is one layout down at the bottom. To create a second layout, we can right click and a contextual window will appear. And the top option is layouts. There's a few options here. New layout, duplicate, which is a copy, relabel this one or delete it, are quite self-explanatory, but I'd just like to introduce the main manage layout properties up here. So this opens up the main layout properties, and it's split up into 3 columns. First shows us the layouts that we have currently, so layout 1. We can rename a layout by double clicking, so I might want to call this my moving fixtures. Some settings in the middle. I'm not going to go through all of these in this webinar, but the important thing is called item visibility over on the right hand side. It again has these little drop down structures, so we can see all of the fixtures in their own groups, but you can go right down into individual fixtures if you need to, and the actual group icons as well. So if we want to hide something, we just untick them. So if I untick my dimmers and my source 4s and all of my groups, you can see that they're hidden from this layout. They're not deleted from the show file, they're just hidden from this particular view. If you want to add something back into a layout, you come back into this layout properties and recheck the items, and when you do, you can see them appearing in the space once again. But for now, let's untick these once again. So I'm left with just my moving lights just here. To add a new layout, so create a second one, we have the plus to add a new layout and the minus to delete the selected layout. So if we click the plus, we immediately see a second layout with everything placed in here by default. To rename it, we can just click it and let's call it dimmers and parkans. And in this example, we'll do exactly the opposite. I don't want to see any groups or any fixtures apart from those dimmers and profiles just there. So I now have 2 layouts. I have one for my moving lights just here, and I have another one for my dimmers and parkans. As I mentioned earlier, you can click and drag fixtures to move them around. This is where you can see the ID number that we defined and also the label in the patch, which is useful, so you can see these underneath each fixture. If we select fixtures by dragging over them and right-clicking, there's a number of arrangement tools that can help us. Some are arranged in an arc. I'll just quickly press these. So if you press arrange in arc or a circle, you get these little yellow handles. So this first one will zoom or contract, and these lines here will just give you the angle of that arc, so we can match our physical stage. And another tool is arranging grid. So if you're an OCD neat freak like me, you can put rows and columns, and that will equally put them in a nice space just here. On the whole, Vista is a visual console. So to help with that, we can actually color the icons. By default, they're all this deep gray color. So these are our blue parkans. So to help with that, we can select icons, right click, come down here to items, and we see something called icon color. So we can specify a color with the pop-up. So now this is the blue icon, just to help us. But you may note that once we start to control fixtures, which we'll get onto in the next segment, the actual intensity in the middle is still white. That's an additional step in Vista, and we call that gel color. So again, if we right click, we can go to items and gel color and complete the customization to know that these lights are my blue parkans just here. To help us a little bit later in this webinar, I'm actually going to just color these guys as well, just so we can see visually what's happening when I start to program cues as well. Let's go for gel color there. I'll do the same thing for these lights. We'll keep them in their gray color. So you can see I'm just repeating this process, going to items, going to icon color, and I'll do the same thing for gel color as well. Finally, I'll just bring these up to the top, pull them all in a nice line. And there we have it. So this is my second layout, which I'm quite happy with. Once you're happy with the layout, you can click the unlocked unlock toggle down at the bottom, just here. When it's locked, it means that you can move fixtures around by dragging and dropping. Because we select fixtures in Vista by these kind of graphical sweeps, it gets really annoying really quickly when things start moving around. So that's why it's handy to have this tool down here. Before we move on to creating some stage looks, I'm going to create some groups for these fixtures just here. Underneath the fixture chooser, we have something that we call our multi-quick picker, which is 4 columns of stuff. And the stuff that we can see in each column is on the left-hand drop-down box just here. So if you click on one of these left columns, the stuff that we can see in these columns are groups, presets, effects, cues, amongst other things. So the first one is groups. As I mentioned earlier, Vista by default automatically creates groups of the same type. So this would be my dimmer group, which is these 18 fixtures just here. Arguably, that's not very useful. So to create your own group, what you do is you select the fixtures, and then in this column down here, you can right-click and press Create New Group. Vista will then ask you to create a new name. So let's give this blue. So we get a new component in this box here, and we also get a new icon in the chooser that we can move around. Other ways to create groups is you can find it in the components dropdown and also new groups. If I press new fixture group, it's exactly the same. It's just another way to find that. So again, that's over here. And we can drag that down here. Another tip that I can give you, and perhaps this is the quickest way to do this, if you select fixtures, and if you hold your yellow console key, so your yellow modifier, or control or command on the keyboard, you can see that when holding it, you can actually click the yellow plus here or in an empty space. So this can be a quick way of just selecting the fixtures, holding control or command and clicking, and we can then give this a new name. So I can call this amber, and then get my amber fixtures over here to select these fixtures. If at some point in time you need to update a group, you can see here that I've missed these two out. We can select the fixtures, and we can right-click the group and press Update from the contextual menu that appears. There's no confirmation of this, but you can see that when you click it, it has updated that group. So that's a little introduction to how we can create groups in Vista. In the next section, I'm going to talk about how we actually start to create stage looks. I'm going to come back to my movie night layout over here and work with some of these fixtures. When you create groups, they're by default placed in all layouts, so you can see the 3 icon groups that I've made just here. If you want to hide something in a layout, you can actually right-click, press Items from the menu, and click Hide Items. But another tip that I could give you, if you're happy with a layout and you don't want groups to automatically appear, within the Manage Layouts, there's some options to auto show new groups. If you untick that, they won't be automatically added to this layout if you create new ones. I'm just going to zoom in on these fixtures just here for a moment. So to create stage looks, we have our Feature Browser, which by default is found on the right-hand side of the application, but this can be moved around if you're left-handed or just want to put it somewhere else. But by default, it is over on the right-hand side, and it's the Feature Browser. So with the Feature Browser, it's split up into 7 main tabs. So the All tab just gives us quick access to simple looks. For intensity, we have this horizontal slider, and we can click and hold to give it some intensity between 0 and 100%. We also have some 10% shortcuts here, Or to get to 0%, we can click the left arrow, or 100%, we can click the right arrow. And this is the same interaction anytime you see a graphical slider throughout Vista software. For example, the focus and zoom sliders at the bottom of the screen, just here. This crosshair is Vista's position control, so we can move forwards, backwards, or left and right. We then have a color picker, so we can choose our color, some gobos, and some beam control, so you can see quick access to a stage state. And importantly, with Vista, you can see that I'm controlling fixtures all at the same time. So this is using something that we call the generic fixture model. So if we choose RGBW LED washers, CMY spots, or fixed color beams, we just tell Vista the creative stage state that we want to see, and the software understands how to create that on those selected fixtures. It's handling all of that Dmx processing information for us. If you want to take a look at something in more detail, each feature has its own individual feature tab. I'm just going to press clear at the top left of my software screen, which would clear my programmer. So you can click clear or F7 on the keyboard or console if you have one. So I can now create a new stage look from the beginning. Let's give it some intensity again, and we'll look at the intensity tab in more detail. So here you can see the same intensity slider as before, but this time we have some more detail on plus or minus 10% increments. This is also where we find generic control over shutter and strobe. So this will be a slow strobe to fast strobe. We don't visualize that in the fixture chooser, but of course in the real world you would see your fixtures doing a slow to fast strobe. Underneath each feature set in Vista, we have our custom Dmx Browser, and that's what these square tabs are at the bottom. So this is actually the direct Dmx control for this particular channel. So this is intensity and shutter and strobe. You can interact with these values if you need to be really specific by typing a numeric number in this box. For example, 130 bits on intensity, and it understands what that is. So you can type numbers, or you can click and hold and imagine an invisible slider to interact with these numbers. With the position crosshair tab, this is our position feature. So with the GUI, we have the same crosshair as before, but from this tab, just using a mouse alone, we can have control over tilt or pan. Another useful feature here is to look on the fine control. If I just move my mouse around here, you can see it's actually quite a coarse control, so quite a lot of movement. If I look on my fine control and do the exact same mouse movement around the screen, I get a much finer resolution. So if you're using Vista with PC or Mac application only, this can be a really useful tool to turn on for fine positioning of any feature, not just position. And for a keyboard shortcut for that, it's holding down the Shift key. So if I do it now, this is a coarse control. If I hold down Shift, I would have a fine control. So that can be a useful key to take note of. The color feature is full of a few more options available to us. So we have the same color picker as before, but this time, as a lighting designer, we can think of color in either hue, saturation, or value, CMY. And you can see that when we move these sliders, Vista's feeding back graphical information to you all the time. So you can even think in terms of saturated RGB if you wish, even though this fixture is a CMY spot. This is just a creative tool. Often a fixture will have a CMY mixing system and or a fixed color wheel. So to take a look at the fixed color wheel within a fixture, you can click in the wheel tab just here. So this would show you not only the colors that are in the fixture, but also their position within the wheel. So if we flick from red to blue, we know we're going to flick through white in real life. If you want to do split colors, you can press index and move this slider horizontally from the left to the right. And if you want to spin something, you can click this spin button. But it's important to mention that when we spin something in Vista, this slider starts from the middle, because if we move to the right, this would be a clockwise slow to fast, or an anti-clockwise slow to fast. I'll explain this a little bit more on the Gobos because you'll be able to see that more clearly. Down at the bottom, again, you can see all of the raw DMX channels which relate to color, and you can still type these in. For example, 135 bits on the Cyan channel, the console knows that just by specifying that, it's just over 50% Cyan. At this point in the webinar, it's also a good point to explain that because of Vista's generic fixture model, we can do things such as edit copy or Control-C on the keyboard and then select different fixtures. So if I select my LED washers and my beams and do a edit paste or Control-V, you can see that the software knows how to do that on all fixtures, even fixtures that don't have a Cyan channel. The console knows it needs to put in this wheel slot purely based on 135 bits Cyan. So that's just another example of the generic fixture model at work. I'm just going to press Control-Z a couple of times and come back to just these spots in Cyan and show you the Gobo feature. So this is actually very similar to the color wheel. We can see Gobo wheel 1, and we can just click on a wheel slot graphically. You'll also see that in the fixture icons here as well. So if I now demonstrate the Gobo spinning, you can see we can select a Gobo, and if we pop it in Gobo spin mode, we can then see when I move to the right, it's a clockwise slow to fast spin, and to the left, it's an anti-clockwise slow to fast spin. This button here, the two arrows, this is reverse spin at the same speed. So this is more of an artistic tool. And the little red house is stop spin. You can also click into the slot if you need it to stop spinning as well. If a fixture has more than one Gobo or color wheel, we'll see some tabs horizontally across the top. So the Viper has a second Gobo wheel. In Vista, we actually treat prisms and animation wheels as additional Gobo wheels. It makes no sense when you say it out loud, but actually working visually, it does make sense because if we want to add a four-face prism, we just click it and we can still work with the same index and spin as we would do with a Gobo. The last column, or the last tab, should I say, is Vista's Beam tab. This is where we can have generic control over frames. This fixture doesn't have it, but if it had mechanical framing shutters, we'll be able to drag these in visually and adjust depth and angle as well. In the Focus tab, this is where we can find generic control over focus, zoom, iris, and frost. The very last tab to mention here is the Custom tab, which just gives us individual sub-tabs of all those direct DMX channel controls across there. The only additional tab here is called MISC, which is miscellaneous, which is where we often hide a lot of control channels that you don't need to be manipulating too often. So you might find those out of the way. One of the last tools when creating notes to talk about here, very quickly, is Vista's fan control. Vista's fan control is a yellow key on your console or the control or command key on a keyboard. If I select some fixtures and hold down the control or command key, you can see that you can fan colors by clicking and dragging. So you're now fanning against your fan mode, which is found to the top right of this screen just here. So fan mode, you can change that. So if you change to become fan from both ends, and I now do the same thing, let's go from blue, hold down my control key and pull to yellow, you can see that it's fanning in this order around here. And we could also do the same for position. So if I reset my fan mode, this is how you would start to fan your fixtures in or out, which we can see moving around in the fixture chooser, just here. So that's a little introduction to how we create stage looks. Let's just press clear to clear our programmer again, and we'll move on to how we can store cues. I'm going to come back to my dimmers and profiles layout for this. So let's create a stage look. Let's select my blue dimmers and we'll put them at full. There's three ways to store cues within Vista, and the first is called Store All. simply store what you're seeing. It's like taking a photograph of your stage, and it's up here in the middle of the function key toolbar, or F6 on your console or keyboard. At the top of the screen, this tells us the destination, so we're going to be creating cue list number 1, and within that, Q1. These are actually just ID numbers. We don't name the cues here. We actually name the cues in these two bottom boxes. So I'm going to call this my Parkan cue list, and if I type in this box here, we'll name the first cue blue. If we click OK, this will actually be stored into the console, but it won't be assigned to a physical playback. The reason for that is we haven't told it where to go. To tell it where to go, you simply click on an empty playback button. I'm going to click here with my mouse, but if you have a real console, you could click physically. So if I now click here, you saw me just click this once. When I now click OK on the store, it stores it to this location. I'm just going to drag this out by clicking and dragging so I can show you what's happening in the Fixture Chooser view. So store all is quite special in that it tries to help you out as much as possible. The first thing that it does is it clears the programmer for you and plays into the queue, so we're left with the same stage state on stage. The other thing that it does is it sets the fader property, which we call auto play and release, which basically means as soon as the fader gets to 1%, it's going to play the cue list, and when the fader gets to 0%, it's going to release the cue list, which you can see by this green bar kind of playing, moving to the right, and releasing, moving to the left. So that's simply it. We've now stored our first cue. So we can go on and create the second stage state. So let's do that. Let's select the red fixtures and turn them on at full. Once we're happy, we can again press the Store All button. And the default action is to store to the last place we're working on. So this is cue list number 1, but now cue number 2. Let's give it a new name. Let's call it red. If we were to tap to a different place on the console, for example, my second playback fader, the console will realize that you want to create cue list number 2, Q1 red. So if you're just learning Vista for the first time, this will be a good tip, is get into the habit of defining where you want your cue to go, and you're never going to accidentally store it in the wrong place. So let's click OK, and we would store that into here. The programmer is being cleared for us, and we can push up and pull down this cue. When a cue list releases, the default action is to start from the beginning. So if we push up again, this is cue number 1 blue, and to press play to transition to the next cue, we press this play button just here. So if I press play, it transitions to the next stage state. Finally, I'll do one more example, which is the amber fixtures, and we'll store these as well. So press store again, call it amber. The default queue time is 2 seconds, but if you want to change that, you can drop this button down just here and select a predetermined time. And you can also change the up and down time by dragging these around like this. So to give a delay to a certain time, you just drag it to the left. And to adjust the timing, you move these blue cyan bars to the right. So what would happen now is the amber lights would fade up in 2 seconds, but the red lights would then fade down in 3 seconds. Let's take a look at that. So if we press play, this is our 2-second blue. Pressing play again will be our 2-second red. But this time, because of our split queue timing, we now have a 2-second amber followed by a 3-second red down. Another important thing to mention about store all is it doesn't care where the information is coming from. It takes events coming from not only the programmer, but also playing back cues or group faders. So to demonstrate this, if I make another example of placing these 6 lights in my programmer, if I press store all and tap a second playback fader, let's just call this store all, and click OK, we can see it's stored here. To release these cue lists, I could just pull the faders down because of the cue list property. But another button to introduce here will be the release key, which is a release all, which by default deactivates all active cue lists. So if I press this, this will be released. So now when I demonstrate this second fader, you can see that it's captured not only what was coming from the programmer, but also what was playing back. as well. One of the most important things that I could possibly explain in this introduction webinar is that the Fixture Chooser screen, so our Live tab, is Vista's programmer, and this has the highest priority in the console, which means anything that we change here is going to be output to stage. It's got the highest priority. But you could also program 0%, and that's what's going to be output to stage. So if you've done this, you could be left wondering when you're playing back your cues, why isn't my stage state playing back as I expect? Have I recorded it wrong, or is something going wrong with the playback? None of that is true. You've just got events in your programmer, and the easiest way to tell that is to see the clear button highlight here, or a little no entry symbol just here as well. So clicking this would return back to the correct playback state. I'm going to press release all once again. So that's using the simplest store method, store all. Another method is to create a new cue list from the beginning. So if we click the new button, this actually creates a new cue list and opens up what we call the live edit. So you can see that we're now working directly within cue list 3 and Q1. And we can just build the queue as if we were building it normally. So let's just go ahead here and create a stage state. I will take these two fixtures. I'll just move them forwards. Let's make them red and yellow. And for argument, we'll just copy this with Control-C and paste it to the other fixtures. The reason this is called a live edit is any changes that you make here, such as make these go cyan, you don't have to update the queue because you're programming directly in this queue just here. To add a new queue in this mode, we click the little green plus up here towards the top right. So if I click the plus, you can now see that I get a new queue immediately, which we can name. Let's call this magenta. And then if I select my fixtures and change them to become magenta, we've now stored this queue. So we can just repeat this process for our entire production. Let's make the lights go green on this next example and call this green here as well. So we now have 3 queues. We can use the playback transport controls up here to play through the queues or skip through the queue list just here. The queue that we're editing when we're in the live edit is this yellow box just here. So we're editing queue number 1. Let's call this cyan and yellow just here. And we can play through this like this. If we click into a different queue that's not playing, we actually engage a mode called Queue View. And this is like Vista's visual blind control. So what we're doing now is we're editing Q3, so we may wish to make this a little less green, but we're still playing to stage cyan and yellow, which is what this little red warning symbol is just here. If we turn off Queue View, the queue that we are editing will return back to the queue that's currently playing to stage. The opposite of that is Vista's link functionality, which means that if we click into a queue, the stage output will immediately change to that and it will snap to it in the live timing. So this is useful if you're rehearsing and you don't mind the stage state changing. It can offer a really quick workflow. We might want to make these green, this half red, jump back to the first queue and make these yellow ones magenta. It's really up to you. So once you've made a number of edits, you can click the close button, which is the X in the corner of this tab, or the close button just here. And Vista will ask you if you want to save those changes that you've just made and keep the queue list active. If you want to save the changes and turn off the queue list, or discard and go back to whatever it was before you pressed the new or edit button, or cancel and carry on working. So let's close and save this queue list for now. And that's now stored into the console. If you want to re-edit a different list in the future, you can press the Edit or Open button, which is found on the third button just here. So if we press this, we could then select the queue list to edit. You can just click on it, and when you click OK, it will open this queue list to edit. One of Vista's most unique functions is the timeline view. which gives us a graphical representation of all of the events programmed in each queue. So here we can see intensity, position, and color. And just like we did with the store all bars, we can click and drag these to give some delay timing, or we can click on the cyan boxes to increase or decrease the event timing. So if I just come back to the beginning of this queue and show you the Fixture Chooser view again, from adding these delay timings for position and color, we can see that in the single queue, the lights fade up, then change position, and then change color. But within the timeline, you can actually go down into individual event times by clicking the little pluses. Now we can see individual events for each fixture, and the same thing happens for being able to do individual fixture times just by dragging and dropping and altering these bars. If I press Ctrl Z to undo this, we can select multiple events together by clicking and dragging in an empty space and dragging over multiple events, or you can click in the vertical column just here. So now you can see I've selected all of my colors. If you take the left or center blue dot, this actually increases or decreases event time based on where you're pushing and pulling from. If you take one of the corner points, you will start to skew time based on where you're pulling and pushing from. So you can see here, the first event will be longer than the others. Whereas if you take the middle boxes and start to skew, you will skew timing, but you can see that each event time is the same. So this would look more linear when we play back the queue. You can also fan events in the timeline. To do that, we have to hold our fan key and our fan mode. So if I change my fan mode to become fan from center, select my events, hold down my fan key, which is that yellow or control or command key, and then drag one of these white lines. If you take the left or right edge, you would fan, and you would once again see that the middle is longer than the outer events. But if we undo that and take the mid edge, also the midline, you can see that the event timing for each fixture is then the same. So if we show you that in the Fixture Chooser view once again, you'll see the lights fade up, they then move from the ends, and then change color left to right. So this is complex event timing, but it's in a way where it looks familiar, and it's actually really quick to program. Overall queue times can be adjusted by typing a new number in this box here, or moving this tab to shrink the overall queue. So now if we play that queue back, you can see the console's automatically updated and skew those times. So perhaps we have a little bit more time to be flexible and experiment with the show's overall creative design. If you want to delete events in the timeline, if you've made a mistake in the programming, you can actually just select the events that you want, right click, and press delete event. Well, of course, you can press delete on the keyboard as well. So I think we're rapidly running out of time on our first webinar. So I'm not sure if there's been any questions there in the chat, Ben, whilst I've been talking.
So I mean, I've answered a lot of questions that we've gone. Something that has come up is there's been we skipped over store part in the interest of time right now. If we have a few minutes left, if we can.
Yeah, of course. I was conscious of the time running away there. Let's just quickly talk about that. I'm just going to grab a quick drink of water from me talking for a whole hour there.
So, and if anyone else has any other questions, feel free to put them in the chat box. I'll pass them along to Jack. Also, if you can fill out the forms, we can update you with any future software releases. As Jack said before, he is showing a Vista 3 or a R3 beta. We hope to have this thing out shortly, so you probably want to be looped in when that hits and everything. So, and with that, I'll let Jack continue on with store part.
Yeah, very quickly just introduce that. Yeah, I did. I was conscious of time.
I have no idea if this meeting's going to automatically end at 9:30 or at.
It shouldn't do, because I made it from, I think, 1 p.m. to 3, just because I wasn't sure either. So
perfect.
I think we have time on the webinar, as long as everyone's cool, just to.
Yeah. So if anyone wants to hang out, and we can keep going a little bit. So yep.
So with store part, that's really your opportunity to say to the console that I'm in charge, I'm programming you, you're going to store what I want you to, not what you think that you should. Because with store all, that's just taking a photograph of the stage state. So if you had your house lights or smoke machine on at full, then they're going to get stored into those queues with store all. So with store part, let's just select these 10 spots just here. If I click store part, you can see that we get a much bigger window because there's more options for us to be able to define. It actually wants to store to the last place we're working on. So this is my queue list that I just made in the live edit. And you can click on queue list and select destinations just by left clicking. Or if you want, you can press a brand new queue list. So you can click new here. Or if you had a console, you could just hit an empty space and that would do that for you. So I'm going to create queue list 4. You actually name the queue list in this box just here, and you name the queue. So if I call this yellow up just here, so this is Q1 with the name yellow up. By default, it wants to store all fixtures that have information in the programmer, which, if you like, is the traditional lighting console storing method. But we can change that a little bit. We could say I only want to store the selected fixtures in the programmer, which right now in this example will be just these 10 spots just here. But if you wish, we can also filter that a little bit more. So we have the feature masks just here. And the icons are the same as what's found in the Fixture browser here. If it's highlighted, it's been stored. And if it's deselected, it's not been stored. The only additional arrow here is these two, which is just a quick way of selecting all features. So if I now untick Gobo and click OK, if we take a look at down here in my queue list components, we have stored the queue. It's here, it's store part. But store part does not clear the programmer for you. That's okay, because you might want to use this look to store a next queue. But for now, let's press clear. I also need to jump back to my virtual MV and just click and drag this to put it over here. And if I push this fader up and down now, it's not automatically playing the queue list. That's because it hasn't set that auto play and auto release property, but that's okay. We have to press play ourselves. So if we press play, we see that store part only with selective fixtures, and it hasn't stored the Gobo, just like I asked. Let's do another quick example. Let's take the beams this time. We'll turn them on in Cyan, and we'll go on this bottom edge, and we'll use the store part function again. All fixtures in the programmer is okay in this example. Let's call this Cyan beams. But it's important to note that this stage state that I'm seeing right now is just these 10 fixtures on stage. Let's click OK, and we'll store it. We'll clear the programmer. We'll play back the queue. So the first is our yellow spots up. But this time on Q2, it's the addition of those 10 cyan beams. So those yellow lights from queue number 1 are tracking forwards into the look of queue number 2, which isn't necessarily the stage state that we had when we pressed store part. And that's one of the main differences between store all and store part. If I'd used store all to use this cyan beam look, the console will have automatically programmed those yellow lights to be off, simply because they weren't on the visual stage state when I press store all. Another thing that we could do, if I just show you one last example, let's add in some additional lights. Let's say green just here. I never said I was a good lighting designer, by the way. But if we do store part and just do this here, so this would be adding a new queue by default, but you can actually use store part to update a queue just by clicking on it. And the default update action is actually merge. So merge in these new changes into the existing queue. And the second option is replace. So completely overwrite the previous information with just this current information. But for now, we'll keep that using the merge functionality. And because we're editing a queue, I can also explain this additional tick box option, which is called Q only editing. What this does is says if you're editing a queue or making a change in this queue, only affect this queue only, which basically means it won't track forwards into the next queue. So let's check that out. We press play, we see the new addition of the green lights just here. But now when we transition to queue number 2, you can see that they're automatically removed from this stage look because of that queue only property. Are there any other questions about store part or any other content that I've talked about during this webinar?
No, there haven't been any other questions come in. Where was asking about some effects and things like that, but we'll take care of that on tomorrow's. Presets. We haven't said much about presets here. That's
We
okay,
did.
Tim.
Do you want me to go through it quickly? I mean, we
Yeah,
had a whole big plan. Well, maybe we needed.
yeah, we can hit a couple presets. That's a pretty easy one to do.
No, it's okay, Tim. Like I said, it's our first webinar, so we weren't sure on how much content to talk about, but it's really easy. Pretty much as a general rule, any show component, be it groups, presets, we call them presets, not palettes or anything else, but they do work in the same way, can be created just by right-clicking. So let's make an example on these two spots here. I'm going to turn them on, put them forwards in red. And to create a preset, right click and just press create new preset and the preset window pops up. So if I call this red, I'll call it down just because we're not using a visualizer. The feature masks are here. So it's noticed that there's position and color in the programmer. Typically, we don't store intensity in presets because you typically don't want to do that, but you can add it in if you wish. Another thing that the console's noticed is this is just a single stage state. It's just one thing, it's just red. So it's ticked a box which creates a global value. And quite simply, if something's global in Vista, it means that it can be applied to any fixture in your show, even if it wasn't necessarily programmed like that. So if I turn all of my fixtures on and press the red down preset, you can see that all of my fixtures go into that global red down position. If I just do a couple more examples, I'll do Cyan up. Again, we can right click, create new preset, Cyan up. This time I'll untick global values and tick fixture type. And what fixture type means is that this preset will only be applicable to the same make and model of fixture, which in this case is a Viper. If we need to try and apply that to different fixtures, you can see that that option is grayed out because we didn't include it. If you do want to update a preset, so if I just program these in manually now, to update a preset, you just create the stage state, right click, and press update. You will get an update window in this scenario just to check your settings. So we want to update that with position and color just here. So now that when we apply that, it's applied. That now works on all 20 fixtures. And of course, if we create stage looks in this way, so if I turn my lights on and press the red down preset, if we're storing queues after applying these presets, when we next come to update these presets in the future, they will automatically update the queues. So they're a reference point. It's like a programming template to update your queue list and general programming. One thing that I should also point out is if I just put presets in the other components here as well, the right-hand drop down is a filter. So if I go to Gobo, we don't see any Gobo presets yet because I haven't stored any. But if I go to position and I go to color, we do. But when we apply them from these filters, we only apply this exact feature. So if I just change the position and color, if I click the red down preset from here, it only applies the color. So I could apply the red down color, but in this cyan up position, or this cyan up color in the red down position, or both. So it's really up to you. You can combine presets together, or you can filter them, or of course you can just store the individual feature. It's really up to you. Does that help clear things up a little bit? And that was quite a quick introduction.
Yes, that has helped quite a bit. Yeah, and for anyone else there have been some questions about some other things like the Q list and Q properties. In the interest of time on this one and to keep it somewhat simple, we're not getting into that because we could spend an hour on just some of the properties of what we can do with Q lists and queues and groups and all this stuff. So this initial webinar is meant to be basic and take someone who might not know anything about Vista at all and allow them to go from a completely blank screen to patching some fixtures and making some lights wiggle. So we're trying to keep this simple without losing everyone that doesn't know anything about it. So, um, Jack, do you want to mention anything about the new user configurable window?
Yeah, we can do quickly. I mean,
Yeah.
it's a really great release space. There's so many. We could do a whole webinar on just some of the new features and changes in itself, to be honest. But in summary, the new user configurable window is exactly the same as what we saw if you were using multiple screens on Vista in the past, external windows. So we can start to just customize this to become really whatever we want. So it's completely up to you, but it means that you don't have to use snapshots to recall this. You don't have to kind of squash up the fixture chooser just to try and put yourself in this kind of big touchscreen based setup if you don't want. And whilst we're here, I should also point out that we can also give a border color to all components in R3, just to give a little bit of separation within your component quick pickers. It's really completely up to you what you want to do with these guys. So yeah.
And for anyone asking about recording this and posting this later, yes, we're looking into that. We started recording a little late on this, so we don't necessarily. I don't think we got the very beginning of it. A lot of the topics that Jack has been covering are also coming from what will be the future training videos. So we will have these as actual, real produced videos in the near future.